Hello, and thank you so much for joining me today for this thought from the Bible. In the last few weeks, we've been looking at the life of the prophet Elisha in the Bible. And if you've missed any of the previous videos, that's fine. They're all standalone. You don't need to have watched them to understand today's video, but I'll leave a link in the description below to the full playlist in case you want to catch up on anything you might have missed. You know, it's easy to read quite quickly about the life of Elisha in the Bible. His story spans a few chapters in the book of 2 Kings, but it's still like a minute portion of the Bible at large. And therefore it's easy to think that all of the events that we read about must happen quite close together. But in actuality, Elisha's ministry lasted for around 60 years. We know this because of the kings that are mentioned in various parts of the story, that Elisha was in operation, if you like, throughout all of those kings' reigns. And so there may well have been years in between these miracles that we are exploring together. Now, it's possible that there were other amazing stories woven in and around those that we know of. Maybe only the most spectacular were recorded. We don't know for sure. These stories might be the only miraculous moments that this prophet encountered. Either way, I think it's fair to say that Elisha's ministry wasn't a kind of a miracle a day affair. I think most of his time was probably spent teaching the company of prophets, speaking to the leaders of the day, proclaiming the truth of Almighty God. And now and then, in the midst of that normality, God would enter the scene in an incredible and mighty way. So at this point in the story, we find a prophet in Gilgal, where there is another base of the company of prophets, just like the one we read about in Jericho earlier in Elisha's story. This time though, and this is what separates this particular story from the rest of the stories we've heard about him so far, there is a famine in the land. There is not enough food for the general populace. And there is also not enough food for the followers of God, for this company of prophets. While we are living here in this world, we are not immune to its problems. It would be lovely if we were, but we're not. We are still susceptible to famine and natural disasters and sickness. But if we never went through any of those hardships, we wouldn't very easily be able to relate to the rest of the people in the world, would we? We wouldn't be able to show how God's awesome power can meet our needs through and in the midst of those difficult situations. See, God, we know that he can miraculously provide food. We read a story in the Bible about Elijah, Elisha's predecessor, about ravens feeding him, bringing him bread and meat in the midst of a famine. But that's not what God does here. God does not miraculously provide food for the prophets in this moment. Instead, this is what happens. While the company of the prophets was meeting with him, Elisha, said to his servant, "Put on the large pot and cook some stew for these prophets." One of them went out into the fields to gather some herbs and found a wild vine and picked as many of its gourds as his garment could hold. When he returned, he cut them up and into the pot of stew, though no one knew what they were. Yeah, I feel for this poor servant of Elisha. Like, you know, Elisha asks him to make the large pot, not just a small pot, you know, cook the biggest amount. And he's probably like, okay, yeah, I can do that, Elisha, right? Calls like a couple of the other prophets to one side, like, what am I supposed to do? There's not enough food in the storeroom here. The prophets asked me to make some stew, but there's not enough food. And one of these these prophets has a brainwave, and he's like, right, I'm going to go out into the countryside, into the fields, and I'm going to try and find something that I can add to the pot, at least some herbs, maybe add some flavor to the water. Maybe that particular man from the company of prophets should have realized that in a famine, the fact that nobody else had stripped the gourds from that particular vine probably indicated there was a problem with them. But he was trying to help. He was probably very, very hungry, and they were in a pretty desperate situation to need to be out foraging for food. They needed to eat, and they did not have enough. But sadly, this is what happens. The stew was poured out for the men, but as they began to eat it, they cried out, "Man of God, there is death in the pot," and they could not eat it. That poor guy had unwittingly poisoned that whole large pot of stew. Presumably with something that would make the people sick, or worse, they proclaim that there is death in the pot. Immediately they recognize that whatever had been put into it could cause them serious harm. But they couldn't just throw it away. That's what we would do normally, right? Right, there is something bad in this food, I'm gonna chuck it out and I'm gonna start all over again. They could not do that. Presumably because they'd added some of what stores remained to them in this time of famine, that small bit of food was absolutely precious. You can imagine how horrendous that guy must have been feeling at this point in time. Because of him, the company of prophets might have to do without. Because of him, the visiting prophet Elisha was going to have nothing to eat. Because of him, their precious stores would now be diminished for no reason. But once again, we find that that is not the end of the story. Elisha said, "Get some flour." He put it into the pot and said, "Serve it to the people to eat." And there was nothing harmful in the pot. What a miracle. In an instant, that stew turned from bringing death, being corrupted with poison, to having nothing harmful in it. I find this absolutely incredible. See, God took what was harmful and he neutralized it. And more than that, he turned it into something nutritious to keep people going for another day. We don't hear of this hand appearing and plucking out the poison gourds. Instead, they are made helpful and made into something that would benefit the people, that would benefit the very man who had made that mistake. What a powerful story this would be for the company of prophets. What an amazing story that they could share with the people around them. We were stuck. We were starving. And in the midst of our problem, God miraculously met our needs. The problem didn't go away. There was still famine. I'm sure that the next weeks and months, maybe even years, would have been lean times for this company of prophets. But now they could trust absolutely in the God who they had seen could meet their needs. I just love the confidence that Elisha has in God throughout all of these stories, all of these miracles. There is absolutely no doubt in his mind that God has the power to do anything. The flour wasn't magic. It had no special properties. It was simply evidence of how God can use something completely ordinary to do something completely extraordinary. And when you remember that these miracles that Elisha was seeing, they weren't everyday occurrences, but were rarer moments in his life. That makes this man's faith all the more remarkable. See, do we believe that God can do anything? Even if it feels like nothing is happening? Even if we find ourselves in a place of hardship, do we still believe that his power is unlimited? That he is working for our good? That we can come to him with any problem, no matter how big or how tiny it may seem? Elisha is a great example to us. It doesn't matter when you were last aware of God doing something specific and magnificent and awe-inspiring in your life, because he is always working and he is always able to step in and to meet our needs. And he has already done the most awe-inspiring, magnificent thing for us in sending his son to die for us. If you feel like you're in a place of famine right now, whether that's physically, this is a hard time economically in the world, whether that's spiritually, whether that's emotionally, you can ask God to enter the scene again. He can turn whatever may have poisoned your pot into provision. He can take what should be theoretically bringing you down and use it as something that will build you back up, something that will strengthen you. He can take that very thing that was meant to destroy you, and he can use it for your good and for his glory. I'm sorry about the rain. Hopefully you can still hear me. This is definitely the rainy season here in Liberia. But I hope that that was an encouragement for you today. That absolutely blew me away when I thought of that stew being poisoned and then literally being purified to be something that could be used for the good of the prophet. So I hope that that encouraged you too. I'll be back on Wednesday next week with another video, another story from the life of Elisha. So I will see you then.